In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at how to build a simple Hello World application using K2 for SharePoint. One of the keys to a successful workflow implementation is essentially being able to describe and lay out your process on paper. Let's begin by taking a look at a graphical design of our workflow as laid out in swim lane fashion. As small as this example is, we still get to touch on the four main components of K2 for SharePoint applications, chiefly data, forms, workflows, and reports. The role of the data component for this application will be played by a basic custom list within a SharePoint site, and it will take the name of Hello World. To initiate a workflow instance, we're going to set up our workflow to begin automatically when a list item is added to the Hello World list. As this workflow progresses, the next thing it will do is bring in the forms component by assigning a task to the person who entered the list item in, or essentially started the workflow. You will notice that we commonly call this individual the workflow originator throughout K2 documentation and in the wizards. The workflow originator will receive an email notification stating that they have been assigned a task and they need to respond to it by either choosing to say hello or choosing to ignore it. They will be able to do this by opening their assigned task from a K2 work list, which will present them with a form to make their decision. If they choose to say hello, then K2 will run with that and automatically update a column named Response in the Hello World list with the originator's name and a greeting. Once the list item is updated on this path, the workflow will end. If they decide to choose Ignore, then we want to have K2 delete the list item from the Hello World list and consequently notify the originator with an email message that their response was ignored and deleted. After that step fires, the workflow will also end. So from this example, you can see how data, workflow, and forms form the bulk of what constitutes a workflow application. Also keep in mind, while all of this is running, K2 is simultaneously capturing data about the workflow in order to give you the ability to report on metrics for your implementation. From the top, let's take a look at what we'll be running through in this exercise. We've broken this build down into 7 key steps for getting a K2 application up and running. In step 1, we're going to look at how to add the K2 for SharePoint app to your site and configure K2 app parts like the K2 work list on a web part page. Step 2 will walk you through adding a new list to your site and, combined with step 3, teach you how to enable the K2 application for this list and wire it up as a data source in K2 for SharePoint. In the building of the Hello World workflow, we'll bring a human element to the table by adding a workflow user task to the workflow design in Step 4. Step 5 will focus on adding server-related tasks to the workflow like notifications and data source updates. I'll teach you how to deploy a newly designed workflow to your K2 environment in Step 6, and in Step 7 we'll run some tests on this workflow to make sure that it functions the way that we intend. And then for some extra steps, steps 8 through 10 will touch on built-in reporting capabilities for reviewing K2 application metrics, as well as showing you how to make changes to an existing K2 application in your environment. Let's get down to it. When you want to create a K2 app with a SharePoint list or library, one of the first things you may need to do is add the K2 for SharePoint app to your site and optionally configure the app parts on one of your web part pages. This step may have already been performed on your site, so if that is the case, you can skip ahead to the next step. Keep in mind that if you have created a subsite and want to build K2 apps within it, you'll need to follow these steps to add the K2 for SharePoint app. In your SharePoint site, let's go into Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps to see what's available for this site. In this step, we want to add the K2 for SharePoint app to our site. So go ahead and select that option under the Apps You Can Add grouping. Now you should get a dialog box that pops up asking you to trust K2 for SharePoint. Since we know this is a trustworthy app, go ahead and click Trust It to begin the install. From here you'll be directed back to your site contents page for this site. However, it may take a few seconds for the application to be completely added, so I'll pause the video and we'll come back once it completes. Okay, that's finished. We have one more step to complete before we can start building workflows, which is to configure the K2 for SharePoint app on this site. To get that moving, let's open the K2 for SharePoint application by clicking on it here. The first time you open this, it will take you through the registration wizard. On the first page, you'll need to confirm the SmartForms runtime URL is correct. For this demo, I can leave this set to the default URL and move on. However, keep in mind, your URL will be different if you're working inside your own environment. Just click on Next, and on the next window, K2 will take care of the configuration settings for you automatically. This will take a few seconds to complete, so I'll pause the video here. Okay, now that the configuration is complete, you ought to be able to validate that it worked by looking at all the green check marks next to each configuration section. It all looks pretty good here, so I'll go ahead and click Finish to move on to the next page. And that's pretty much it for the basic setup of K2 for SharePoint, so click on the name of your site to get back to the top. And also keep in mind that your site's name may be a bit different than mine as we work through this training together. So there will be a point where you're going to ask, how do my users open tasks that are assigned to them? Let's address that question now by adding the K2 Worklist app part to the landing page of our site. In order to do this, we'll edit the site landing page and then go to the Insert tab to find the App Part button from the ribbon menu. When you click on this, it will open up a list of app parts available to insert on the page. From here, select the K2 Worklist app part from the parts list, and then select the section of the page you want it to land on. In this case, all we get is rich content from the dropdown, so I'll leave it at that and click Add to get the worklist visible on the site. Then to save this change back to SharePoint, click the Save button either to the left of the ribbon menu or in the upper right just above the ribbon menu. And once that saves and opens the page back up in display mode, you'll notice we have the K2 Worklist app part ready to go on the page. That's the end of step 1, so let's take a moment to consider what we just did. Note that the K2 for SharePoint app has only been installed for the current site, so if you want to use it in other SharePoint sites, even subsites under this one, you'll need to repeat these same steps to enable the K2 for SharePoint app in those sites. We added the K2 Worklist app part to this site so that users can open their K2 tasks from within this particular site. Adding the Worklist app part is optional. Your K2 application will still work just fine even if you do not add the Worklist app part to this site. However, you may want to consider centralizing the work list on another site within your organization so that users have a common place they all go to open their tasks. In step 2, we're going to create a new list in SharePoint called Hello World that is going to act as our data source for this application. I want to begin by creating a custom list on our Learning K2 site, but before doing that, since this is one of the most common tasks in SharePoint, if you already know how to do this, feel free to skip ahead to the next step in the demonstration. Otherwise, stick around and we can walk through this step together. Okay, so from here, let's go ahead and open Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps from the landing page. And from under the Noteworthy section, go ahead and select Custom List. I'll go ahead and call this list Hello World, and then click on the Create button to allow SharePoint to drop the list into our site. We need to add one more column to this list, so go ahead and open up the list by clicking on the Hello World link here. And from the List tab at the top of the page, select List Settings from the ribbon menu. Then to add our new column in the list, head to the Column section about halfway down the page and click on Create Column to get to the new column window. This column is going to capture the response greeting from the user if they action their task as Say Hello from the user task form. So fittingly, go ahead and name it Response. And then we'll keep it set to single line of text, and then we can leave the description field blank today. This field isn't required and it doesn't have to have any unique values enforced. Also, go ahead and leave it set to character length of 255 and no default values. That should do it for this new column, so save it out. And we're done with the settings for the list for now. So click on the Hello World link at the top of the page or from the menu on the left side of the page to go back to the Contents view for this new list. So at this point, we've created the SharePoint list that will be used as our data source for this application. Hang around for the next few steps to see how easy it is to create the K2 application for the Hello World list, which will include configuring data objects, a workflow, and also enabling basic reporting. In this step, we're going to generate a new K2 application for the SharePoint list that we just created. We're going to use the K2 wizard to generate data objects based on this Hello World list. It will also generate a workflow that starts when a new item is added to the Hello World list. And it's going to create a page that includes reports for the list for our Hello World application. To create the K2 application for this list, you'll want to bring up the Hello World custom list that you just created and open the List tab at the top of the page to expose the ribbon menu. Remember, you can follow this same process that we're going to do for libraries if you want to enable the K2 application for them on your site as well. Since we just added the K2 application to our SharePoint site, you should see that there are two new K2 options in the toolbar available for this list. We're going to check out the Reports option a little bit later, but go ahead and select the K2 application option in the K2 menu group. You may see a working on its screen for a few seconds here, so after which you should see the Create K2 Application Elements screen appear. If you recall, K2 applications consist of data, forms, workflow, and reports, but you don't have to enable them all unless you need them. Let's take a look at each of them here before we move on. By default, you're going to enable a smart object for the list, which allows any workflow you build against this list to gain access to its data if you select the option to allow it to be used in workflows. You can scope them here to be available only to workflows created for this list, or for workflows throughout the rest of the site or subsites. For this demonstration, you can just leave it set to List Library. Let's take a look at Smart Forms now. You get the option to create K2 Smart Forms for your application as well, which gives you the capability to replace the default out-of-box forms SharePoint creates for you if you want. It's beyond the scope of this lesson, but you can also go on to customize those forms to enhance your user's experience if you choose to do so. I'm not going to use Smart Forms for this demo, so I'm going to leave it unchecked for the time being. And since we definitely want a workflow to be created against this list, I'll select this option and configure it to start anytime a new item is added. And what this is going to mean is an instance of the workflow will begin each time a user adds an item to the Hello World list. Make sure to check out all the options and ways to start a workflow that are available when you select the radio button option when the following events occur. We'll touch on some of the other options throughout some of our other build guides and examples. Moving on, let's name it Hello World Workflow for simplicity, but if you're working in your own development environment, keep in mind if you've got other developers that may be running through this course, you may want to add your name to the name of the workflow to keep it unique. The last element to enable on this page is Reports at the bottom. I want to show you the reporting capability K2 gives you to summarize all the workflow activity that will occur for this list a little bit later on. Let's enable it here, and then we'll look at it when we test the deployed application. And at this point, you can go ahead and click OK to give K2 the go-ahead to create and configure all these elements. You may have to wait a few seconds for this to complete, but when it does, you will have successfully set up your K2 application so that your workflow will be able to access the list as a data source. You'll have a blank workflow that is set up and ready for you to configure, and also the reporting page will be available to measure the success of your application. In the previous step, we were able to create a new K2 application for the Hello World SharePoint list. In step 4, we want to bring in some human interaction by adding a user task to our K2 workflow. If you're coming in from the previous step, K2 should have automatically generated the workflow artifacts for your SharePoint list, including dropping you to a blank workflow design canvas so that you can start building the Hello World workflow. The first step we're going to add to this workflow will be a user task to ask the person who just added the item to the Hello World list, or workflow originator, if they would like to say hello or ignore the greeting. Since we decided to use the standard forms provided by SharePoint, we're just going to use the SharePoint user task step for this event. On a side note, you can find all the K2 for SharePoint events that are available from the left menu group options on the ribbon menu at the top of the page by scrolling through the groups here. The user task event that we want happens to live in the general workflow steps group, so drag that down from the menu and drop it on the blank slot on your canvas. The User Task Wizard will open up to allow you to configure some of the properties of the user task step. I'm going to name this step Respond to Greeting and provide some meaningful instruction to the user for the task. Keep in mind, these instructions that we enter in here will also appear on the generated form that the user sees when they open their task. Now we're going to enter in two possible actions that the user can perform in the next box. We want the user to either say hello or choose to ignore the greeting. The workflow will execute differently based on the action that is picked by the user, so I'll show you what that looks like here in just a bit. But also keep in mind that you can add more actions here if your process calls for it down the road. We only need 2 actions for this application. So now that I have those, this means we can move on to the next window. The next window gives us the opportunity to pick the form that will be displayed to the user. You can give them the chance to edit the SharePoint list item when they open the form, or keep it in a read-only layout by selecting Display. We don't need to let the user edit the original record here, so leave it set to Display for now. Then we'll move on to the next window to configure the participants for this task. The Participants window allows you to decide to whom you want this task to be assigned. For the purposes of our application here, go ahead and drag the Originator option over, since this signifies the person who added the item to the list and started the workflow. But also notice over here on the right side of the window, you also have the ability to search for other users in SharePoint, like Bob. And you also could search for groups as well by changing the search context to group and entering in something like sales. It's all based on what groups you have in your environment. If you want to let this user know that they have a new task assignment, you can notify them by email by selecting that setting. Notify participants when they receive a work item. Seems like a pretty nice thing to do, so let's go ahead and select that, and then we'll move on to the next window where we can configure that message. Okay, so on this screen we have the option to customize the notification message that gets sent to the user when the task gets assigned. Select that option to open up the settings for the message. Check out the body of the message and notice that K2 automatically fills in some dynamic contextual information along with static text about the task assignment for the user here. For now, we're not going to mess around with the default body of the message, but let's add some context to the subject line before we move on. We're going to take the value entered into the title column by the user from the list item that started this workflow and put it in the subject line for the message. So notice the context browser section over on the right. For this example, expand the item references group inside that little window and drill into the Hello World reference that refers back to the list item that started this workflow when it was added to the Hello World list. Now you can drag and drop the title column onto the subject line over on the email message. Item references are K2's way of keeping track of information that relates to the workflow. When you start a workflow from a list item in SharePoint, K2 will store a pointer to that list item in the item references collection so that you can interact with that list item throughout all the steps you create in your workflow if necessary. Just think of it as a quick way to read the properties of data objects, in this case, a list item in a SharePoint list. And item references aren't the only way to access information from other locations. You'll also notice there are quite a few other context areas available in this menu for use where you can get values from such things as smart objects, which provide access to other external data sources. You can also use various inline functions to calculate values dynamically or even drop workflow context fields into your process. You'll be able to find these options covered in many of the other learning exercises provided by K2. And that's all we're going to do with the notification and the user task, so go ahead and click Finish to complete the user task out when you're ready. Now your workflow should appear similar to mine. We have a user task ready to go, and it has 2 paths based on the 2 actions that we entered in, mainly say hello and ignore. To recap what we've done, we basically added a workflow step where a user, in this case the workflow originator, needs to make a decision about what the workflow should do next. Based on what this person decides, the workflow will then follow that particular path and then perform more steps. In the next step, we'll take a look at configuring the rest of the steps based on the user's decision. In step 5, we're going to look at how to add workflow server tasks to the application. So let's go over and get started. If you recall earlier in the demonstration, I walked you through the workflow design as it appeared in swim lane fashion. One of the lanes represented the human side of our workflow, and the other swim lane represented the system. We've taken care of the human side of the process already by configuring the user task on the workflow design canvas. Once the user makes their decision, we want to have the system handle the original list item in SharePoint in one of two ways. If the user ignores the greeting, then the system will delete the list item. However, if the user chooses to say hello, then the system must update the list item with a greeting response using the workflow originator's name. To get to the workflow steps available to you for interacting with list items in SharePoint, select the List Items group from the ribbon menu at the top of the page. If the user chooses to ignore, then we can delete the original list item by dragging and dropping the Delete List Item workflow step down to the blank slot on the design canvas for the Ignore path. And in this case, K2 will go by default and configure the Delete List Item step automatically when it first drops on the page. You may be asking, how does K2 know how to do that? Well, K2 assumes that you want to delete the list item that originally started the workflow here, so it uses the item reference that we spoke about earlier and automatically configures the delete list item step with that reference. You do have the ability to change this around and select a different list item if your process has the need to do this. You can click on the workflow step from the canvas and drill down to the Specify List window. And notice that it's already set to the Hello World reference here. Again, K2 automatically configures it to reference the list item that started the workflow. If you wanted to, you can also select Browse to List Item to filter down to a completely different list item specifically for this workflow step. But in this example, we'll leave it set to the default selection. Next, let's take care of the Say Hello path for our workflow. Our goal for this step in the workflow is to update the original list item that started the workflow with a response value by dragging and dropping the Update List Item workflow step down to the empty slot on our canvas. When this wizard gets added to the canvas, we are required to do some configuration to tell it what needs to be updated. In this case, it is set to the original list item reference from the Hello World list that started the workflow. Remember that you can also browse to another list item in this wizard if you have a workflow that requires that. But for now, let's use the Hello World item reference and move on to the Specify Values window. On this window, K2 loads up the various columns available from our Hello World SharePoint list. The title column can be left alone because we don't want to update or change the original value for that. Let's add some context to the response column though. I'll add some text here for our greeting, basically stating hello. And then I want to use a dynamic field representing the workflow originator's display name from the context browser group called Workflow Context. So open up that group, and then to get the display name, move down and drag the originator full name field over to the response text box, and drop it next to the word hello. By doing this, the response should be something like Hello Bob Maggio or Hello Holly Anderson if Holly started the workflow. Once you get that complete, go ahead and click Finish, and then we'll move on to the next step. In step 6, we're going to deploy the workflow so that it's available for users to use against the Hello World list. At this point, we need to deploy the workflow in order to make it available to users when they add items to the Hello World list. You can do this right from the Workflow Design tool by clicking on the File menu option in the top left of the page above the ribbon menu. Then select Deploy from the menu items that appear. From here, K2 will validate your workflow, and then it will deploy to SharePoint if everything looks good. You'll most likely have to wait a few seconds while K2 does its work, but when it completes, you should get a message stating that it was successfully deployed to the server. Okay, so once you see the success message, go ahead and click on Close and Exit, and you will be taken back to the K2 Application Elements page. On this page, you have the option to click on each of these elements to open them up for editing if you want to. But from here, let's move on and test the application. Now that our application has been generated and deployed, in step 7 we're going to test and run our application. Well, we've reached the testing phase for this exercise, so if you're still on the K2 Elements page, click on the Hello World link at the top to get back to the list where we'll add some new items to this list. Remember that we configured the Hello World workflow to start when a new item is added to the list. So select New Item from the list menu at the top here and put First Test in the title text box. Go ahead and save it out. We're going to look at some different ways of completing tasks in our K2 application, so go ahead and add 2 more items to the list called Second Test and Third Test. I'm going to pause the video here for a few seconds while I do this. Now that we have some items in the list, we should expect 3 task assignments to be sitting in the K2 work list on the landing page of the site, since that is where we added the work list app part if you recall earlier in the demonstration. There, as expected, we can see the 3 tasks assigned and waiting for us to respond to the greeting from K2. I'm going to use the first test assignment to demonstrate completing the task by using a form. To open the context menu for this task, hover over the row and select the arrow that appears on the right side of the row. If you select the Open Form option, K2 will open the form associated with this task. Recall that we selected to use the standard SharePoint display form for this task because we didn't want the user to edit the list item. K2 uses this view in this case and adds the workflow information to the top of it, which allows you to action and complete the task. Notice as well that the instructions we entered in for the user task wizard are provided to the user here. So for this task, let's just go ahead and select the Say Hello action to complete it, and then submit the form. Now let's take a look at the second test item. I want to action this task without actually opening the form, which K2 makes easy by providing the 2 possible outcomes in the context menu for this task. Hover over this row and click on the arrow that appears again on the right. Notice the 2 actions we configured are available here in the list. In this case, go ahead and select Ignore, which should lead to the deletion of this list item. You'll also notice that once the task is actioned this way, it disappears immediately from the work list for this user. Real quick, let's take a look at the results for these 2 decisions by jumping back to the Hello World list. It looks like our application is working pretty well as intended, which is great because the first test list item has the response value populated with the originator's name since we chose to say hello. And as such, the second test list item has been completely deleted from the list since we chose the ignore action for that task right from the context menu. Now link back to the landing site where your K2 work list is sitting. Let's touch on some other features available while we look at the third test assignment still waiting for us there. There's a nice reporting feature that's also in the context menu for the task item that I'd like to show you called View Flow. So open up the Tasks menu and select View Flow from the menu list. When you break this open, you'll get to see an interactive graphical report that displays the current status of this workflow instance. Some visual indications are at work here to show you where the workflow is currently sitting. Notice that the Respond to greeting step is currently blue. This indicates that the workflow is currently sitting on that task waiting for the user to make the decision to either say hello or ignore. You can go ahead and click on this workflow step to get some more information about the workflow. When you do this, the Activity Summary view opens up and gives you some information about the name and description of the step, status, a start date, and also duration, in other words, how long it's been sitting there. If you click the Participants tab at the top, you can also see who is currently assigned this user task. So you can see that the View Flow report is a pretty useful way to track the current status of a workflow, as well as the path and outcome the workflow follows as it progresses to completion. Now we've seen 2 ways to action a task. In that I mean completing it by submitting the designated form for the task, or by selecting the action directly from the task context menu in the work list. I'd like to show you a third way to action a task, which moves toward a great option for users that are away from the office but have access to their email in a mobile situation. Keep in mind, this isn't limited to just mobile situations. So remember that we also send an email notification out to the user when they are assigned their K2 user task. I'll bring up my Outlook client for the administrator account since the task for the third test list item was assigned to that account. Notice in the inbox there are 3 messages for each of the test items that we added to the Hello World list. Let's take a second to action the task for the third test list item by email. I'll go ahead and select that email message to bring it up and click Reply to open up the message for editing. So all you need to do now to action a task by email is reply with one of the possible outcomes in the first line of the message. I want to say hello to this task. But remember, you can also ignore it in this case since that is a possible outcome as shown here in the message down here below. I'll send that off now, and at this point, K2 will be processing that message automatically in the background, and when it finishes the task, it will be removed from the user's task list. We can also jump back to the view flow for this workflow instance, and we can watch it interactively move the workflow instance on based on our response to the task. This may take a few seconds as the system does its processing. There you go, so now you can see which path we followed. Now that the task is complete, we should also receive a message back from K2 that it successfully processed our email response in the user's inbox. In Step 8, we're going to report on the application by utilizing some of the reports that were generated back in Step 3 when we created the K2 application. To access the generated reports for a K2 application in SharePoint, go to the list where your K2 application was created originally. In our case, open up the Hello World list. Once that opens up, click on the List tab at the top of the page. You should see the ribbon menu open up, and then from here select the report icon from the K2 group of ribbon menu options. After a few seconds, you should see the generated reports for this list appear. So notice the graph report on the left-hand side of the page. This bar graph represents all the workflows created against this list. For our Hello World list, we only have one workflow that we created. Go ahead and click on the Instance Count bar graph link for this workflow. When you do this, it will bring up a list of workflow instances on the right-hand side of the page for the selected workflow. As you can see, there is an instance available for the 3 list items that we just created. The nice thing about this is K2 automatically captures this information for us to include in these reports. Other than telling K2 to generate these reports for us, we don't have to do anything special that requires extra development work to get them. Keep in mind, if you choose not to have K2 generate the reports for your application, it will still keep track of this data for later use if you want to enable the reports or do something with it on your own. In the list of instances shown here, notice the right-hand column has an icon for the view flow report for each list item. The nice thing here is you can view the workflow history and path it took by clicking on the icon for an instance. So in looking at the first test item, we know that it followed the Say Hello path per the user's decision for their task. Let's go back to the second test instance where we selected the Ignore path. When you open up the view flow here, you should see that it graphically depicts that path history for us. And of course, if we go back to the third test item, we chose the action Say Hello. So here you can see it's displayed accordingly. Another item of interest appears here when you select one of the workflow instances from the list. I'll go ahead and select the third test item here to expose the activity instances for this workflow in the report that appears at the bottom of the page. Now this report shows you information about all the steps that fired within this workflow. For example, you get the activity name and how long it took before that step was completed amongst some other bits of information. One of the nice capabilities about these K2 reports being provided is they give you a quick glance into audit-related information, such as who performed a particular task and what their decision was. If you recall from earlier, by opening the view flow for one of the workflow instances, you get the option to click on any of the user tasks in this graphical view to see who the participant was that made the decision. So in this case, the Participants tab from here gives you a good bit of information about who completed it, when they completed it, and what their decision was. K2 will keep this information indefinitely, so at any point in the future, if the need arises, you have the ability to easily go back and review the history for your process. And there you have it. The first 8 steps of this scenario pretty much covers what it takes to build a K2 application in SharePoint. However, you will most likely reach a point where you want to make changes to your application. I'll show you how to handle that in step 9 of this scenario. In this step, we're going to update our existing application by first adding a new column to the Hello World list. We want to capture the date that the workflow has completed with a new date column. Then we'll need to regenerate the smart objects affiliated with the list, which in turn will expose that new column to K2. Finally, we'll make a couple changes to our workflow. One change will add a send email step to the end of the ignore path to let the workflow originator know that the ignore action was selected, and the second update will be in the update list item step already in the say hello path of the workflow. For this update, we'll make sure that the new date column we added gets set to the current date and time when the workflow was completed. So let's have a look at how to do this. In order to handle this change, we need to first add a date column to our Hello World list. So let's open up the Hello World list from our SharePoint page and then click on the List tab at the top. From there, go over to the List Settings option in the ribbon menu. Once you're in List Settings, scroll down to the Column Settings and select the Create Column option, and let's add a column called Reply Date. We want to set this column to store a SharePoint date and time value. And we can leave the rest of the options as is, so go ahead and select OK and we'll continue on. Now that we've added a new column to our Hello World list, you'll see it in the view right here on the list page. If we want to use this column in our existing K2 application, we need to go and tell K2 to rediscover the SharePoint list and find the new column. So click on the List tab again at the top of the page and select the application from the K2 group of ribbon menu options. When you do this, you're going to be redirected back to the K2 Elements page, and you'll notice in the upper right-hand column that K2 takes a few seconds to validate smart objects and look for changes. Since we added the reply date column to our list earlier, K2 has found that the list and existing smart objects are out of sync by indication of the warning here on the page. K2 gives you the option to regenerate the smart objects, views, and forms whenever it finds these changes. But since we're not using views and forms for this list, all we need to do here is select the Regenerate Smart Objects option. At this point, we can start taking advantage of our new field within our workflow. Select the workflow element on your page, and then click on the Edit button in the menu just above the elements to open up the workflow for editing. Keep in mind, on your design canvas, you can rerun any of the wizards for these steps that exist by double-clicking on them as you see the need. So let's do this with the Update List Item wizard first. You can start by double-clicking to get the wizard open. And on this first window, we can just click Next and move on to the next screen. We also don't need to add any outcomes to this step, so click Next to move on to the Specify List window. Leave this window alone as well. We can keep working with the original Hello World item reference pointing back to the list item that starts the workflow in SharePoint. On the Specify Values window, you will now see the reply date is available just below the response column we configured earlier. Now we can use the date picker provided by K2 to select a value for this field along with the time settings. But when you do this, the value will be the same for all workflow instances, which kind of defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do with a dynamic date when this decision is made. So instead, we want to use one of the inline functions provided by K2 over in the context browser on the right. So select the inline functions group from the context browser and open it up. Then you can expand the date and time group to expose all the date functions that are made available by K2. Scroll down to the Now function, and once you get there, drag that over to the Reply Date text box. Just a quick keynote here. Inline functions are operations that K2 will perform when the workflow is running in order to provide a dynamic value as it processes the workflow step. What you'll see happen in this case is when the user selects Say Hello, K2 will still update the response column with hello and the originator's name, and it's going to add the current date and time into the reply date column. Okay, so we're done with that step now, so go ahead and click Finish. And that sums up the changes we want to make for the Say Hello path in our workflow. The next thing we want to add is a new workflow step that sends an email message to the person who created the list item to tell them that the ignore path was followed. Let's get this moving. The first thing we need to do is add an outcome to the workflow where we want to add the new step. In this case, the delete list item step is our lucky candidate. So single click on the delete list item step and move your mouse over to the workflow step outcomes icon in the upper right corner. You can click on this icon and then select the Add button in the window that appears next. Let's just go ahead and call this outcome Continue for now, and then we'll move on by clicking OK. So we've added a new outcome, but we still need to add the email step task into the blank slot created off of the delete list item step. This is pretty easy to do by going up to the general group of workflow steps in the ribbon menu at the top of the page and dragging the send email step down to the blank slot. K2 will launch the send email step for us to configure. First, we want to send this message to the person who started the workflow. And remember, we can determine who started the workflow by opening up the workflow context group from the context browser on the right. There we can see the originator email field, which we can just drag over to the to text box for our message. Next, we want to use the title of the original list item in the subject line for this email that is sent to the workflow originator. You may be thinking, well, we can just get that field from the Hello World item reference, which is true. You can drag that field over to the subject line, but by the time this step fires in the workflow is going to fail because it can't find the list item in SharePoint anymore, mainly because it was just deleted in the step before. So how do we solve this dilemma? Well, actually, K2 stores the title for this list item in a field called Folio. If you expand the workflow context group again, look at the Folio field that appears in the list. Go ahead and drag and drop the Folio field over to the subject box for the email message, and you've got your title now where you want it. Let's take some time to talk about the Folio field. Folio is really just a human-friendly unique reference for each instance of a workflow. When you start a workflow from a list item in SharePoint, K2 stores the title of the list item automatically in the Folio field so that it can associate the workflow back to the list item in SharePoint. You can actually use any value you want in the Folio by updating it within the flow of your workflow if you have the need. It doesn't necessarily have to be unique for every single workflow instance, but keep in mind, it's a good practice to figure out a way to make it unique in some fashion so that you can identify a particular workflow in reports and the K2 Worklist app part that your users use to differentiate and open their tasks. An example of this might relate to a workflow that manages a customer order entry process. You may want to configure the Folio to show the customer name and a unique order reference number. In another example, you may also have a leave request process in your organization where you would use an employee's name and leave dates and also leave type as values for the Folio. And that's it for the Folio. So the last thing we're going to look at is the content of the email message. Let's just add some text that relates to the fact that the greeting has been ignored and the list item was deleted. You can also drag and drop fields from the context browser into the body with the text to make it a more informative message. But to save some time, I'm just going to add this little simple message with a little apology about the deleted list item. And that's it for the email step, so go ahead and finish it out, and you'll see that we've added a new step to the ignore path in our workflow. One last thing, don't forget, in order for K2 to take advantage of these changes, we still need to go and deploy it out to the system. If you recall, you can do this by going up to the File menu in the upper left and selecting Deploy from the menu list. K2 is going to take care of saving and deploying the new workflow out to the system, and then once it's done, you can go ahead and click Close and Exit. In step 10, we're going to take a few minutes just to test the updated application. Let's go back to the Hello World list if you're not there already. We want to add a couple more list items here to validate that our updated workflow is going to work. For this demonstration, I'm just going to call these items 4th test and 5th test. With these two items added to my list, I can go back and look at the K2 Worklist app part now to see the two new tasks that have been added for me to work. Briefly, take a look at the Folio column that I spoke about earlier. Notice that K2 automatically uses the title from the two list items that we just added, fourth test and fifth test. This is done to differentiate the workflow instances and tasks. For the fourth test task, I'll go ahead and select the Say Hello action from the context menu to save some time. And then for the fifth test, I'll select the Ignore action to test that path out as well. Now let's go back to the Hello World list to see what kind of an effect our changes had on the outcome. Notice here that the fourth test now displays a date in the reply date column, representing when the task was completed with the Say Hello path. This worked out correctly since this is what we configured in the Update List Item Workflow step. By selecting the Ignore action, you can also see that the fifth test list item has been deleted from our list. But in regards to that, we should have also received an email from K2 stating that we followed that path, and it also conveys its sincerest apologies for having to delete the list item. So let's quickly check out Outlook to see if that email came in. And there you have it. The email message is there, and it also displays the title from the folio field of the list item in the subject line. And it also has the text that we entered into the wizard for the body of the message. Okay, so now that we're done with the exercise, let's briefly review what you've learned in this exercise. You learned the basics on how to create a new application in SharePoint. You also learned how to build a workflow with some simple steps, incorporating both user tasks and server tasks such as updating a list item and sending an email notification. You also learned how to edit an existing application as well as enable and run reports for that application. So although the scenario we used in this practical exercise was very basic, you now probably know a lot more about K2 applications than you may realize. You should now see how a SharePoint list can be used to store data and start new workflows. You should understand that a K2 workflow can include tasks for users as well as the system, that users can make different decisions on their tasks, and that the workflow will respond differently based on those decisions. You discover the context browser and learn how you can use values from the context browser in workflow wizards, and how the workflow can interact with items in SharePoint. You also learn how you can make changes to an existing K2 application and how to run reports on a K2 application. So you should now have a solid foundation to start building some of the more advanced scenarios in this guide. Good luck as you move forward with building some of those scenarios in K2.